Good afternoon. I'm Alex Stone from Oregon State University, and today I'm going to talk about the dry farm tomato system project that we're working on, and I'm going to talk about the variety valuation aspect of that project. I want to thank my collaborators, Matt Davis and Amy Garrett, as well as Cassandra Waterman, Brad Ramsey, and Maricose Rhodes, who picked a lot of tomatoes this summer, and our other partners, as you see on this slide, and most especially Western Sarah for funding this project. So when we started this project, we looked a lot at the existing and very successful dry farm tomato production system down in the Santa Cruz and San Francisco Bay Area. There they are growing in this coastal, humid and cool climate, very different from our hotter, drier Willamette Valley summers. And they have focused the production and marketing on early girl tomatoes because of the very intense flavor they have when they're grown dry farmed. So we started, I think back in 2017, actually doing research, and we used early girl as our tomato because we were assuming that it would do well here because it does so well in coastal California. But what we found is that while on some sites, early girl actually does perform fairly well when dry farmed, on many sites it doesn't. And this is a really good example here on this slide where you see 74% blossom end rot and what's really a crop failure. And so that is the reason that we embarked on this ambitious variety trialing project that I'm talking about today. So we looked both near and far to find varieties to trial in 2020. Our primary criterion was to find tomatoes that were known to be blossom end rot resistant, but we also grew favorites of farmers, whether they grew them dry farmed or irrigated, and we just looked around at many different places. We also did do some grafting trialing, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because in 2019, we showed that grafting early girl onto Fortamino rootstock improved the productivity of early girl when dry farmed. So here you see an aerial photo of the variety trial at the research station here in Corvallis, and this was taken a few weeks after planting. And here are just some good examples of two plots. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plants grown in 75 square feet of one variety, and right next to it is 5 plants of a grafted scion rootstock combination. And this is not a replicated trial, so these are the only 5 plants of that variety in this entire trial. We planted them May 8th through 11th and allowed them to sprawl. We harvested the tomatoes weekly. We took yield data, the number and weight of fruit, and then also the number and weight of fruit with blossom end rot. And then we also took notes on sunburn, cat facing, and green shoulders. The full report is extensive, and you can find it at this URL. A way to get there is to go to OregonVegetables.com, which is the Oregon State University vegetable production website, and then go to Fresh Market Vegetables at that website, and then you'll find the report. The report has many components. It gives you all the details, and if you want to learn more, please go find that report. But today I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. So it's known that different tomato types are differentially susceptible to blossom end rot. So cherry tomatoes are known to be resistant, very small and round. Whereas elongated large tomatoes like paste tomatoes are known to be the most susceptible. So we grew all types in this trial. We did grow cherry and saladette tomatoes. What we found early on in our harvest collection, that these small fruited tomatoes are indeed resistant to blossom end rot, so we saw almost none. And as the tomatoes came into full production, we weren't able to take harvest data throughout the whole season because it's so labor intensive to harvest cherry tomatoes, as I'm sure many of you know. So we stopped harvesting them, but we kept observing them. And what we can say is that these tomatoes are very resistant to blossom end rot. So our recommendation to farmers and gardeners is to grow your favorite small fruited tomatoes, because you're very likely to be successful with them growing them dry farmed. So in the future, we are not going to grow those. We are going to focus on these types of tomatoes that are very susceptible. And the great news from 2020 is that we found many of these varieties that show promise for dry farm production in the hot and dry Willamette Valley. So how did we identify our top performers? Our first cut was to cut out the varieties that had more than 15% blossom end rot, which left us with 48 varieties. Those are all listed and described in the full report if you want to find out more. We then cut out low yielders, less than 20 tons per acre of unblemished yield. And that was 23 varieties, and those are listed in the summary and report as the top performers. We also, for everything but paste tomatoes, cut out varieties that had small fruit size. So if they had an average fruit size of less than 1/5 of a pound, we dropped those out. So what did we find? Well, here's our list of red varieties, not paste, but red slicer or beefsteak tomatoes. And they are diverse in type, diverse yields, blossom end rot incidence, and fruit size. While some of them are prone to cat facing or green shoulders, some of them are not. It's a very promising list of tomatoes. So Frederick stood out because it doesn't cat face or have green shoulders. It's a new hybrid from Vitalis, and Vitalis is a seed company that breeds vegetables for organic production systems. And so what Vitalis will say about Frederick is that it's a medium-sized beefsteak known for its flavor. It has a lot of disease resistance, and it is an indeterminate tomato, but it's compact because it has a short internode length. In our trials, it had a high yield of 32 tons per acre, 2% blossom end rot, and a nice fruit size. And you can see that in this photo, that they're really a nice red slicing tomato with no blemishes. So a very promising variety. So we also found a diversity of different colored tomatoes. So we have 4 yellow and orange, 2 purple, and 2 pink that passed this really strict evaluation strategy. So that is also very promising. One of the varieties that stood out to all of us in the crew picking these tomatoes was a Zoychka. So a Zoychka in our trial, essentially no blossom end rot, 42 tons per acre yield, and a nice fruit size. What Adaptive Seed says about this, because that's where we got the seed, is that their crew loves the Zoychka too, almost every year. It comes up as being one of their favorite tomatoes. It is resilient to varied weather conditions, and also it has a more delicious flavor than many of the other yellow tomatoes. So this seems very, very promising also. We did find 5 paste tomatoes, 4 red and 1 yellow, and I didn't even know that there were yellow paste tomatoes. I actually took these home in August to process into sauce, and I thought that they all tasted really, really, really good. So there's a lot of promise in the paste tomato department as well. So I mentioned that we had shown in 2019 that when we grafted Early Girl onto Fortamino rootstock, it reduced blossom end rot and improved yields and increased fruit size. So we wanted to explore grafting more in 2020. So we used 5 rootstocks and 6 scions. And what we found is that while one of the rootstocks really is not good for dry farming, it did not improve productivity. The 4 others did. An interesting thing that we saw is that the scions that we used in the grafting part of the trialing, none of them actually met our strict criteria to become top performers, mostly because they had high blossom end rot incidence. But what we found is that you can graft your way out of that problem, at least with some varieties and some rootstocks. So here are 2 good examples. So here we have Big Beef grafted onto Fortamino, beautiful, big, large tomatoes. When we grew Big Beef without grafting it, 38 tons per acre, 28% blossom end rot incidence, which is why it didn't become a top performer, and a pretty large fruit size. But when you graft it specifically onto Fortamino, very high yields, almost no blossom end rot, and a doubling in fruit size. BHN 871 is this beautiful, beautiful golden beefsteak hybrid, ungrafted, a moderate yield, very high blossom end rot incidence, and a third of a pound fruit size. When grafted specifically onto DRO 141TX, very high yield, low blossom end rot incidence, and almost a doubling in fruit size. So one of the things that we know from the literature in grafting tomatoes, and there's a huge national grafting project going on right now, is that the interaction between a specific scion and a specific rootstock is unique. It's not like we will say, okay, DRO 141TX is the one to use for every scion. It may in fact be the case that DRO 141TX works really well with BHN 871, but not so well for big beef or some other tomato. And it may be, if we ever have the funding to really get into this, that we could find specific rootstocks for specific scions, because those would be the most productive and have the highest quality and most flavorful fruit. So that is one of the big questions. Do any of these tomatoes taste good? Because what we know from the California experience is that the reason why there's such a strong market for dry farm tomatoes, and dry farm early girls in particular, is because they're so flavorful. So we have not done formal taste testing yet in this trial, partly because of COVID, but also now that we have identified varieties, what we want to do is know how do they taste when they're grown dry farmed. So this summer, we do want to compare dry farmed and irrigated tomatoes of these varieties that we've identified. We want to compare grafted and ungrafted tomatoes. And we also want to describe some of these new varieties. Most of the varieties I've talked about today are unfamiliar here in the Willamette Valley to farmers and to consumers. So we want to be able to talk about them. So we'll do this work with Chef Tim Wastel from Portland, and also Lane Selman from the Culinary Breeding Network in OSU. So I just want to conclude by big thanks to the tomato crew. We couldn't have done it without you. And also, again, to our funders and partners. Thanks.
It looks like there's a question in the chat box here. So what do you consider a small versus large round in the trial? Not variety, but size. What's the size cutoff?
That is a good question. And I don't know the answer to it off the top of my head, but I don't know if that is actually in the report, although you can see what the fruit sizes are of the ones that passed that. That's a good question that we should possibly strive to put into the report.
There's another question here, Alex. Were there really good heirloom varieties that came out?
Yes, actually, most of the germplasm that we grew are heirlooms, or we didn't really grow very many hybrids, although I mentioned Big Beef and Frederick, both of which are hybrids, but that actually is sort of the exception rather than the rule. Mostly we grew open pollinated tomatoes. We grew some really interesting historic tomatoes that we got from Steve Peters at Seed Revolution Now. He is actually one of our partners, particularly as we go forward. He is trying to improve heirlooms, and one of his goals is to improve them for dry farm production. And so he's working on us with us on that. And then also we got a lot of varieties from Adaptive Seed, who only have open pollinated, mostly heirlooms. I don't know what the definition of heirloom is, but heirlooms from all over the world. Uprising Seed, Victory Seed. So we did actually grow predominantly heirlooms. We also, and I didn't mention this, grew some tomatoes from the Dwarf Tomato Project, which I had never heard of until the Organic Seed Alliance conference last winter. But one of the people who started the Dwarf Tomato Project was a speaker in their tomato session. And so we did trial quite a few dwarf tomato varieties, which are, they're dwarf indeterminate tomatoes. And I believe it was Dwarf Sweet Sue that actually came up into the list of top performers.
Any other questions here? We still got a couple more minutes for questions here. Matt just posted the link to the variety trial report, which is a link to the website where Alex has all the, Alex and Matt have all these resources archived really nicely.
I also want to say that we're going to try to see if Jacques Newcomb will send us some of his germplasm to trial, because it sounds so exciting that he's been making crosses and selecting for dry farm production there in the heat of where he is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just had a question come in. Did you try some of the storage tomatoes from Italy?
So yes, we did. And Amy did actually put some into storage, and she can speak to that. Amy, why don't you talk about what you're doing?
Sure. So we actually, on our bulletin board, which I posted a link for, we posted an opportunity to participate in a storage tomato trial. And we saved, so we put, it was 7 varieties into storage and hung them. And there's a picture of that on our bulletin board, you can see. But we ended up saving seed on 3 varieties that taste and stored really well, and in fact still have them. So have been eating tomatoes in the winter just to kind of see how they do. But we're planning to engage the Dry Farming Collaborative interest and anyone interested in participating in that trial. And we'll be working with an undergraduate researcher to carry that through and be presenting about this next year at the meeting.
And I did want to mention that I have been accumulating seed of the varieties that did well last year, as well as new varieties that we want to trial for the first time this year. So we have excess seed of some of those high performing varieties. So if you go to the bulletin board, you can see there's a place for you to identify that you'd be interested in getting seed of some of those varieties to grow this year. And also, if you do have a variety that you would recommend that we trial, we would be interested in trying quickly to get seed of it, because it's tomato season already, so that we could include it in our trials.